Welcome back to the channel if you've been here before, and hello if you're new. Today I'm going to attempt to answer a question that's been asked of me many times at this point, and that is how to crochet or create your own colorwork grids.
Exhibit A.
This is a question that's come up fairly regularly over the last couple of years, but for whatever reason, it has seemed to come up with increasing frequency in the last couple of months. So I thought today was a good opportunity to answer it, or at least answer it to the best of my abilities. Because there's so much information that I want to convey, I've decided to break this video up into 2 parts minimum. I am open to having more parts to the series, depending on if there's anything else we want to cover, but at this stage it will be 2 parts. In this video, we're just going to cover the basics, how to crochet a colorwork grid, as well as designing your own colorwork grid, sort of the foundations of that. And I'm going to show you 3 different ways or 3 different methods on how you can approach this. In the follow-up video, which if everything goes to plan should be out in 2 weeks, but in that video, we're going to cover how to create your own blank grid entirely from scratch using a free program. We'll also go over how to add an image to that grid. And if you have an image that needs to be pixelated, I'm going to show you a couple of methods I use to do that as well. And the final thing we're going to cover in that video is resources. So just a bunch of free programs and things I use to make my colorwork creation a little bit easier. And a lot of them can also be used for other crochet related stuff as well. But we're not going to go into too much detail on those today. We're going to save that for the next video. Today, we're going to get started with the basics of colorwork. But before we begin, you will need to gather your supplies, and this will include things like your yarn and hook, a tape measure or ruler. Stitch markers are optional but highly recommended as they do come in handy, an idea, an image, or both, and finally, tools with which you can create a graph or grid. This can be a pen and paper, an app, or a software program. Once you have all the required supplies, you will need to decide how you want to approach your colorwork project, because there are a couple of different routes you can take on the grid to crochet pipeline. The ones we're going to discuss today are turning a pre-existing pixel image into a crochet piece, starting with a blank grid, adding a design, and then crocheting that, and finally taking a measurement, creating a grid to match that specific measurement, adding an image or a design, and then crocheting that. Before we go into further detail here, I just want to mention a couple of important things. Number 1, I will be sticking with US terms throughout this video. And number 2, I will be working with single crochet for all of my examples. These methods can be applied to other stitches like half double crochet or double crochet, for example, but I will be working exclusively with single crochet. Second thing I wanted to mention is that I am right-handed, and unfortunately I am not ambidextrous, so I can't really advise you from a left-handed perspective. The methods I go over may still work for lefties. Maybe you have to reverse them. I'm not 100% sure, so any lefties out there, please feel free to correct me down in the comments, or just if you want to share your experiences, just weigh on in down there. All right, with the caveats out of the way, let's get into it. The first method that we're going to go over is method A, and that is taking a pre-pixelated image or graph and then crocheting that. This is where I would recommend you begin if you are a newbie. It's a good place to start and to learn sort of the basics of colorwork. If you're wondering where you can find these pre-made images, I would recommend searching for terms such as alpha pattern, XYZ, pixel art, ABC, even perla bead 1, 2, 3. When you've settled on a design, count how many boxes your image has, both on the horizontal and on the vertical. This will tell you how many stitches across and how many rows tall your piece will be respectively. For example, in this image, there are 14 boxes on the horizontal and 12 boxes vertically, which means we will need to crochet 12 rows, and each of those rows will consist of 14 stitches. When you're ready to begin crocheting, create a slip knot and chain the number of stitches or boxes in your row +1. Again, just as a reminder, I'm working with single crochet here. If you're working with half double crochet or double crochet, you will need to chain an additional 2 or an additional 3. If we take the previous example, the image had 14 boxes across, so we will need to chain 14 + 1, or 15 chains in total. To read the pattern, start in the bottom right-hand corner and follow row 1 of the grid from right to left with each individual box representing 1 stitch. Also remember to crochet your first stitch in the second chain from the hook. That was the reason that we chained 15 and not 14. After crocheting the final box or stitch in the first row, chain 1, turn your work and crochet row 2 back in the opposite direction, or working from left to right. Continue crocheting back and forth, using the boxes as a guide and changing colour where necessary. When you reach the final row, finish off and leave a yarn tail long enough that it can be weaved in through the backs of your stitches to secure it. So that's method 1, pretty simple. If you would like a more detailed tutorial on, say, changing color, for example, I will link another video down in the description. I went over that at the beginning of my Pokemon Blanket Cal series. So it is an older video, but I still think the information is relevant. So that will be linked down in the description if you're interested. While method 1 is the simplest, it's also the most limiting. You are restricted to the pre-existing number of columns and rows, which will dictate the size of your piece. And while you can change up the colors, you are still restricted to the original shape and detail of the already existing image, which, as I mentioned, is a good place to start if you're just learning. But what if you want a bit more choice? What if you want to custom make your own colorwork grid? And that brings us to method B, creating your own grid. The first step to method B, as the name suggests, is creating your own grid. There are a number of ways you can go about this. You can go old school and make one using, ruler, pen and paper. You can use pre-printed graph paper. You can use an online grid or graph generator. Just consult the Goog about that one. You can use an online tool specifically catered towards artists such as Stitch Fiddle, or you can go with the final method. And to be honest, this is my preferred method. This is what I use. And that is to make your own custom grids using sort of vector graphic software or an app. The reason it's my go-to and why I would recommend doing this for yourself if you can is because while the initial grid creation process is time consuming, it's repetitive, and honestly, it's kind of boring. At the end of the process, you can export your grids as a PNG with a transparent background, and that way you can reuse them over and over again. So despite the initial time cost of creating those grids, it's actually a lot more efficient long term, especially if you plan to do a lot of color work. As I said in the intro, there will be a follow-up video to this one where I show you this process. I show you how to create a grid completely from scratch, start to finish, and export so you can reuse it again. But for now, let's get back to method B. So first, you need to determine what tool or program you're going to use to create your grid. When that's done, you will then need to decide the size of your project. So how many stitches across and how many rows tall you want that project to be. Let's say, for example, we want a project that is 20 by 20. Using your chosen tool or program, generate or create a grid that matches those measurements, so 20 boxes across and 20 boxes high. When that grid is complete, you can either design your own unique text and or image by filling in the squares, or you can take a pre-existing image like we covered in method A and transfer it onto your new grid. Doing it this way, rather than just crocheting the image as is, allows you that little bit more freedom to adjust both the size of your grid as well as the positioning of the image on your grid. After that, so you've either designed your own or you've placed a pre-made image on your new grid, it's time for crochet. And we are going to do this the exact same way that we did in method A. Begin with your slip knot, chain the number of boxes you have across +1. Again, I'm working with single crochet. Then crochet back and forth until you've completed the entire grid. So So that's the basics of how you create your own grid. Again, I'm going to go into this in much greater detail in the follow-up video, but for now, the question sort of becomes, what if you want to customize that grid even further? What if you want your colorwork piece to be a very specific size? Well, that brings us to method C. Method C requires measuring first, and I'm going to break this explanation down into two parts. There is quite a bit of overlap here. You'll find you'll probably need to use both methods in order to properly size a project. I just think it's easier to understand if I break them down. So that's what I'm going to do. Part 1 is measuring an item or object and then tailoring your grid to fit those measurements. In part 2, we're sort of going to do the opposite. We're going to measure our stitches and then use that measurement to work out not only the size of our project, but roughly how many stitches and rows that project will be. So let's start with 1 because 1 does come before 2. Grab yourself a tape measure or a ruler and measure whatever it is that you want to make a crochet colorwork project for. This could be a book cover, it could be a laptop case, maybe it's even a nice warm winter jumper. Can be absolutely anything that you want. First, measure the horizontal or how long your object or subject is, and then measure the vertical or the height. Pro tip, write these measurements down, especially if you're someone who deals with brain fog or other memory issues. Save yourself the trouble and write the measurements down. For the next step, you're going to need the specific yarn weight and hook size you will be using in your final project. This won't work otherwise. It does need to be the same yarn weight and hook size. When you've got that, create a slip knot and begin chaining. What you're aiming to do here is create a chain that is the same length as the horizontal measurement you took. For example, if I wanted to make a case for my phone is about 8 centimeters wide, though I'll add a couple of centimeters to each side for both seam allowance and a bit of wiggle room. So let's bump that up to 10 centimeters. My aim now is to keep chaining until my chain, when held firmly but not overly tight, is 10 centimeters long. Remove or add chains as necessary until you've reached the specific length needed for your project, and when you have, stop and count how many chains you've just made. This number is how many stitches you will need to crochet for row 1 and all the rows thereafter, providing you're not planning on increasing or decreasing. I'd recommend writing this number down as well, but before you do that, remember to chain an additional 1. That way we can begin row 1 in the second chain from the hook. So that's the horizontal number of stitches sorted, but this method doesn't work quite so well for the vertical measurement. Theoretically, it could. You would just keep crocheting back and forth in rows until you hit that target measurement. So however tall your item or object was, you just crochet back and forth in rows until you hit that, which is perfectly fine if you want to crochet a solid color rectangle or square. Doesn't work quite so well if you want to do color work, which is why for determining how many rows you'll need in your project, I recommend method C part 2. Like with part 1, you will need the exact yarn weight and hook size you plan to use in your finished project. If you use a different yarn weight and hook size, it will throw off your measurements, rendering this entire process kind of pointless. Additionally, you will need to use the same stitch as you plan to use in that final project. So again, for me, that is single crochet. With all that in mind, your next step is to crochet yourself a little gauge swatch. This is nothing fancy, it's just a square of crochet which you can measure. I usually do a 10 by 10 square. I find this is a good size because it doesn't take too long to crochet up, but it is just enough stitches for my tension to sort of settle into consistency. To make a swatch like this, begin with a slip knot and then chain 11. Starting in the second chain from the hook, crochet 10 single crochet back down the chain. When you reach the end of the row, chain 1, turn your work, and then crochet 10 single crochet for row 2. Repeat this for 8 more rows until you have a square that is 10 stitches across and 10 rows high. Now that we've got our swatch, we can begin measuring, and there's 3 ways you can approach this. I find they each have their own uses, but you'll have to determine which method is best for you. Method 1 is to measure the width and height of a single stitch. So just one little stitch in the row, we're going to measure that. Number 2 is to count the number of stitches within a specific measurement. If you don't understand that, don't worry, we're going to cover it in greater detail in a moment. And then number 3 is to measure the entire swatch. I've used all of these methods for small, medium, and large projects respectively. But to be honest, my preferred method is method 2. I just find that works really well. It's really consistent most of the time. But as I just said, you can use whatever method you find easiest or whichever one you think will work best for your project. So for method 1, all you need to do is measure the width and height of one single stitch. When you have that measurement, all you need to do is multiply the width measurement to determine the number of stitches across, and multiply the height measurement to determine the number of rows. For example, if one individual stitch was half a centimeter wide and 1 centimeter tall, a project that was 10 centimeters across would contain 20 stitches, and if it was 10 centimeters tall, there would be 10 rows. For method 2, my preferred method, we're going to take a specific unit of measurement. In my case, I like to use 1 centimeter, but you could use any measurement with this. You could use 2 centimeters, you could use 5 centimeters. Perhaps you're someone who prefers to work in inches. I could never, but perhaps you do prefer that. Remember that measurement, put a pin in it, keep it in mind, then take your measuring tape or ruler, lay it on your swatch, and count how many stitches appear within that measurement. Using my swatch as a guide, I can see that 1 centimeter across equals approximately 2 stitches. If I spin my ruler so it's now vertical, I'll measure the rows in the same way. Doing so tells me that 1 centimeter is approximately equivalent to 2 rows of stitches. And now, using this information, I can estimate the stitch count of any project regardless of size. Because I know that 1 centimeter equals 2 stitches, I can take the width of any project I want to make and double that to give me the correct number of stitches. So 10 centimeters wide is 20 stitches, 20 centimeters wide, 40 stitches, 50 centimeters wide, 100 stitches. And the same thing applies for my rows. Because I know that 1 centimeter equals approximately 2 rows, all I need to do is determine the height of my project, double that number to give me the approximate number of rows. Again, as an example, 10 centimeters equals 20 rows, 20 centimeters, 40 rows, 50 centimeters, 100 rows. You can literally work out the size and the stitch count of any project measuring like this. Again, and I've mentioned this a few times, but it's important, so I'm going to stress it. As long as you're using the same yarn weight and hook size for your swatch as you are for your final project. And the last method is to measure the entire swatch. We're essentially doing the exact same thing we just did in method 2, except we're working with slightly larger numbers. We already know our swatch is 10 stitches by 10 rows. Measure each to figure out how many centimeters 10 stitches equals and how many centimeters 10 rows equals. Then use those figures to work out the total stitch count of your overall project. Again, this is the same thing we just did in method 2, except this time instead of 2 stitches equals 1 centimeter, we're using 10 stitches equals 5 centimeters. All 3 of these methods pretty much achieve the same results. You just might find, depending on the size of your finished project, the overall size, you may find one of these methods more advantageous to use than the others. So now that we've done all that measuring, we know the final size our finished project is going to be. We know how many stitches across we need. We know how many rows tall it's going to be. We're going to take that information and convert it into a grid or graph. And from this point, we're just going to follow what we did in method B. And I mean grid creation method B, not measuring method B. Just in case that was a little bit confusing. If you are confused, there will be timestamps down in the description. So we're going to go back to the drawing board, whether that is your pen and paper or it is your vector graphics software. We're going to create our grid to the specific measurements that we've just worked out. After that, you're going to design or add your image. And then finally we can get to crocheting. And this too is crocheted in the same manner that we did for method A all the way back at the start. And yeah, that is the basics of how to get started with your own color work grid. We did touch a little bit on customization, especially for the sizing there at the end. But as I have said previously, I mentioned in the intro, there will be a follow-up video to this where we go into a little bit more detail. So stay tuned for that if you're interested. Before we finish up here completely though, we need to do... And today's featured creator on the hookup is Chris, and she says, been crocheting for roughly 16 years, adult colorist, and attempting to learn how to knit my own socks. I wish you luck on your knitting journey, Chris. I too am going to be starting my own knitting journey soon. I'm a little bit nervous. I'm not sure how much I'm going to enjoy knitting, but I'm going to give it a go anyway. Please go and give Chris a subscribe and a follow. It looks like she does have her own YouTube channel, so go head over there and subscribe to that. If you would like to apply for the hookup, there is a link to a Google form down in the description, so just fill that out and you're good to go. Thank you all for watching. I hope if you're someone who is interested in color work or learning how to make your own grids, you found this somewhat useful. A further thank you to my patrons for your amazing support. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. Like the video if you enjoyed it, share it if you think it's worth sharing, and I will see you all next week with another video.